Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and I'm back for another important interview. As you guys know, I've been working to finish the Pyramid of Power series. I'm on the final episode, the 17th episode, looking at all the various pieces of this puzzle and trying to answer the question, who or what is at the top of the pyramid? And my guest today is somebody who spent quite a bit of time asking these questions, and what I think is doing a really good, nuanced, forensic look at these topics, not coming from a conspiratorial background and necessarily just buying all the theories wholesale, and also not just dismissing things out of hand and saying, okay, that's conspiracy theorists nonsense, there's nothing there to see, but instead has actually looked at these topics from the perspective of a historian, which makes sense because today we're talking with Professor Rick Spence, who is a historian and somebody who's long time studied these topics. So thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on. My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I've been aware of your work here for a little bit now. I mean, as I've been doing my research on this series and going back and looking up for primary source documents and looking up the best of what I consider the best research on topics like the Freemasons or various other groups, I came across your work, specifically the course on Great Courses, which I did take, and I have the transcripts and all your research and everything. And as I said, I think you've done a great job of looking at these things. So today I kind of just want to pick your brain on a number of topics. But before we get into everything here, maybe you could just share a bit about your background and how you got into interest in this. I know you study other things besides just secret societies, Russian history and military espionage, occult history. But what was the first sort of incident in your life that just, made you decide to go down this road?
The incident, well, people often ask me what kind of a plan I had, and the answer to that is that there was no plan. I was interested, I was in college. I actually started out as an art major, believe it or not, and then I became an English major because there's no money in painting, and there wasn't much money in, as an English major, how much more is there to say about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? But I was really interested in history because history is this, it's a kind of story that never ends and can be constantly reinterpreted. And I think the thing that probably I've always found, I found then and I find now, even more so now, about history isn't how much we know, but how much we don't know. How much of what we think we know is in some ways BS, because a lot of it is. There's a tremendous amount of BS that's found its way into the historical canon. So I was interested, I don't know, maybe that was just, sometimes I think because it was the easiest route in some way, but I ended up becoming a professional academic, God help me. But my main academic area of study when I was in graduate school is history, working on a master's and PhD, was in modern Russian and Eastern European history, and also Middle Eastern history. So Russia, Ottoman Empire, Balkans, Poland, Lithuania, that whole bowl of wax. English history didn't really interest me that much, or American history, I mean, it was all too familiar. But that's what kind of, one thing leads you to another. So here's the way I've often explained it. In studying modern Russian history, what's the big event? What's the thing that you're going to run into? You're going to run into the revolution, or revolutions, if you want to think of it. And when you encounter a revolution, one of the things that you encounter politics, but the other thing you encounter is conspiracy, because you don't have a successful or even an unsuccessful revolution for the most part without conspiring. It requires that. Because if you're trying to overthrow the government and you're not being conspiratorial, you'll be dead by noon. So you encounter all of the kind of background skullduggery that goes on with revolutionary movements and the efforts to suppress them. And there was a particular incident in looking at that. The first book I wrote was a biography of what is today a very obscure Russian revolutionary figure, a fellow by the name of Boris Savinkov. In his day, he was fairly well known, but it tells you something that since his death in the 1920s, he's largely been relegated to the this sort of dark court. He's been written out of a lot of historical accounts. You'll see his names crop up, or his name crop up, but you'll find out very little about him. And that's basically because he managed to piss off everyone in the course of his career. He was ambitious. He was treacherous. Okay, he wasn't very trustworthy. He bit every hand that ever fed him. Betrayed everyone. So that's how you end up being written out of history. But I was interested about him because if you actually go back and look at events throughout the whole revolutionary period, he pops up continuously and often in fairly important roles. So it was in the aftermath, it's that period when the Tsar falls in early 1917 before the Bolsheviks take over. Savinkov was an important figure in what's called the provisional government, which was this interim regime between the two. And he was a figure of some importance in the military and political establishment. And he was approached by a member of the Romanov dynasty, the member of the family. So keep in mind, beyond the Tsar and Tsarina and their kids, there was a much larger thing of aunts, uncles, cousins. And it was a clan. And what it was that one of the Grand Dukes, I can't remember which one, but one of the Grand Dukes approached Savinkov, who was basically in control of the town. The Grand Duke and his family were sort of being held prisoners in the town, and the town was full of revolutionary ferment, and the Grand Duke, being who he was, didn't feel safe, and he wanted to get himself and his family out of the town to get somewhere safer. So he went to Savinkov, the man in charge, which was kind of interesting because Savinkov, just a few years before, would have been trying to kill people like this Grand Duke. Savinkov, among other things, had been a terrorist in his revolutionary days. He had plotted blowing up people just like this. And so the two men seem to have nothing in common. That is, politically, they have nothing in common. They don't really know each other. So the question might be, why would a member of the imperial family think that this former revolutionary terrorist, now military commandant, would help them in any way? Well, the answer was that they were both Freemasons. And there are certain obligations that one has in Freemasonry. They can be taken more or less seriously. One of the ideas that, if a fellow Mason is in trouble, you have some obligation to assist him. Supposedly not breaking the law, but give him as much assistance as you can. And this is what the Grand Duke did. He knew that Savinkov was a brother Freemason, and he went to him and basically said, look, I know that under the circumstances we would be enemies, but we are both joined by our oaths to fraternal brother, we're both brothers in the lodge, and I ask for your help. And Savinkov gave it to him. I never really encountered anything like that before. And it was really the first time I really sort of sat up and took notice of secret societies, of oath-bound orders, of these connections that went beyond things like politics and class. Connections that could, in fact, override those, which it did in this case. It took people who were otherwise political enemies, and it had them work together. And from that point on, I began to, when I was looking at people, particularly when I was doing Savinkov's biography, of trying to just note all the people that he came in contact with who were members of Russian Masonic lodges. And you begin to develop that most of the people, well, this was a very small group of people. Well, you were talking about the Russian Empire in its heyday under the Tsar had maybe 170 million people in it. Not that impressive number today, but it was at the time. But out of that 170 million people, how many people in that were members of Masonic lodges? Tops, a couple of thousand. Maybe no more than several hundred. In other words, a very, very small group. And here you'd have to think, well, how could let's say a group of no more than 2,000 people, 1,000 to 2,000 people, how could they have any real influence in an empire of 170 million? Well, it depends on who they are, and this is where you find out that among that 1,000 to 2,000 people, there were a very large number of political figures, government officials, members of the imperial family itself, not the Tsar, but his cousins and his uncles very often were, captains of industry, and senior military officers. In other words, it was something that was part of the Tsarist elite. Even there, it was a very small part, but these were very influential people. And they were bound together in a particular way that otherwise wasn't visible to the outside world and didn't really conform to the kind of political interests you assume that they might have. And that was where I could see that whatever exactly it was, Freemasonry, even though its membership was very, very small, was a common denominator among much of the elite at that time. And when you then carry that over to other countries, France, Britain, the US, elsewhere, you would find much the same thing. Now that still leaves the big question, what exactly does that mean? And I guess that in some ways I've spent part of my career trying to figure out. That was where I ran into secret societies. Other things I'm interested in when you deal with conspiracy, espionage. I'm always hunting for spies. And that then oddly enough leads you into secret societies, esoteric orders, espionage. You get into the realm of occultism, which is another thing that binds people together in otherwise in invisible ways. I'm also very interested in military history as well. So I have a fair amount of particularly unhealthy knowledge about things, obsessive knowledge almost about things like World War I. I'm not a World War II guy, really. All right, I'm a World War I guy, which just shows you what a fuddy-duddy I am in that regard. So,
but it's anyway. Interesting, all these overlaps here that you're discussing there with, like you said, finding Freemasons and secret societies and the history of revolutions, but then also finding captains of industry, and then, like you said, how that touches on the occult. There's a lot of different ways we could go there. I want to stick with the topic of the Russian Revolution for a minute, actually. And you wrote a book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, which I know some of my audience is familiar with this topic. A couple of things I'd like to ask you about this. First off, I know that in the coursework, you mentioned Anthony Sutton and some of his research, and I think, if I remember correctly, you sort of, not that you say he was totally incorrect, but what are your thoughts, generally speaking, on Sutton's research looking into maybe some of the similar topics in Wall Street funding, Bolsheviks, and some of those other aspects? Do you think he was accurate, or maybe he went further than what's provable?
Well, I think that Sutton, so my book is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. His book, which inspired that, and I give him full credit for it, if you will, it was Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. I wanted to take a somewhat what I actually set out to do at one point, I actually tried to buy the rights to his book and to take his book and to really sort of expand it from there. That became impossible for a lot of reasons, partly because the rights appear to be owned by a religious cult, which doesn't want to sell them. So I won't say anything more about that. But Anthony Sutton was, in many ways, a kind of researcher ahead of his time. And he's doing most of his work back in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's a lot more information available now than there was then. And particularly from the Russian side. So, the 1970s is the era of the Cold War in the USSR, and Westerners getting access to any kind of really deep information inside the Soviet Union was not entirely impossible, but extremely difficult. There wasn't much, so he's only kind of looking at this from one side, and even the material that was available for, let's say, Western and American sources were quite limited. One of the things that's really made a huge change in research is the digitalization of information, of archival material, and also particularly with newspapers. And it used to be that, newspapers, which tended to decay over time, the most you could hope for is the newspaper had been microfilmed. And that then, of course, meant getting microfilm reels and putting them in a microfilm reader and going through what was a very laborious task of looking through the microfilm. And you may be looking for a single article or the rest of it. There's nothing that was searchable. Now, with digitized newspapers and records, you can really kind of cut to the chase by searching for particular names and terms. So there's just a lot more information available than there was in his time. Given what he had to work with, I think Anthony Sutton did tremendously useful work. He has a kind of trilogy. There is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, I think Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, which I actually think is probably the best of the three, and then Wall Street, I think, and the Rise of FDR. He was looking at those three. And what he was really unveiling here were the interconnections between what we like to call international finance and modern political evolution. Again, everything from politics in the U.S. to German politics and Russian politics. And the common denominator in this is the role which money played, and in which various, I'll put it this way, what he's actually describing here are people investing in political outcomes. And I think that's one way to look at it, where you're dealing with what do bankers do? What's investment capital all about? It's the fundamental goal of capitalism isn't to make products. I think this is what a lot of people get wrong about it. I'm not claiming I know everything, is that, it's all about making things, automobiles, widgets, televisions, smartphones, whatever it is that people want to buy. No, what capitalism is about is the creation of more money. It's wealth which is used to generate more wealth. Creating products and selling them is just a means to that end. And what do you do with the wealth which you have? Well, you go out and buy yachts and airplanes, that's part of it, but mostly it's then used to invest that money in other areas, to generate amount of wealth that can then be invested in ventures that will generate more wealth. It's about creating more and more capital. Capital creates capital, and it does that through strategic investment. And one of the things that you can invest in, if you have lots of money, are political outcomes, political business. That is, you can invest in a revolutionary movement to carry out regime change that will then hopefully install a regime that will be more amenable to your economic interests, that will, grant you concessions over its natural resources. And that's basically, I think, what Sutton was describing here. In Germany, there were German and Western interests who invested in the Nazis, not because they had any particular interest in Nazi ideology, but because it seemed like an investment, that this would be a regime that might be more useful in the long run. I mean, even if it's the idea that it's a regime that would almost certainly start a war, well, if you're involved in the manufacture of weapons and munitions, you want regimes that are going to start wars, because that's how you make money. It's an investment. So let's invest in bringing about a belligerent expansionist regime in power in country X, so that it will attack countries Y and Z, and let's generate a war from which we can profit. We will invest in the way of doing that. It's the same reason as I elaborate on in my book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, and as certainly Sutton pointed clearly to in his original. It was the same thing with Western interests investing, particularly American ones, in the Russian revolutionary movements, because it was a way of leveraging out of power a what appeared to be an out-of-date regime that wasn't particularly amenable to their interests, and replacing it with what seemed to be a more modern one that would grant, and which eventually did, which is granting concessions. I mean, a way to look at this, a perfect example of it is the Ford Motor Company, you know, which is headed by Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford was a man of diverse and peculiar beliefs. Among other things, he was a raging anti-Semite, which never prevented him from doing business with Jews if it was a way that he could make money off of it. So how he might have felt about them personally had nothing to do with business. But Ford Motor Company, you'll often see it noted that, well, you know, Ford Motor Company did business with the Nazis. It did business with the Third Reich. Well, you bet they did. So did ID&T and most other major Western firms, because it was profitable. That's why they do it. But what gets less attention, and I think deserves at least equal attention, is that Ford very early on was one of the first Western, particularly American corporations that waltzed in to do business with the Soviets. And again, because it was profitable to do so. As early as 1919, you know, when a lot of the Western countries are still technically at war with the Bolsheviks, Ford is, you know, perfectly willing to sign contracts through third parties to sell them trucks, tractors, whatever is necessary. Stalin's great venture of collectivization, this veers off, you know, into Russian history for a minute. The Stalin Revolution, it was based on the idea of taking a lot of labor out of farming and putting it into industry, freeing up people from the countryside so they could become industrial workers. And the way that was done was through mechanization, was through tractors. Where do those tractors come from? Well, those tractors were built in Russia, but they were licensed designs. They were the Fordson tractors. They were the Putolevets in Russia, but they were a fully licensed version of the time-honored Fordson, the same thing that were being driven by American farmers in the Midwest. And in fact, you know, Ford's architects, Albert Kahn and Associates, built an auto factory in Moscow. They built a tractor factory. So all of those tractors that were being churned out of Soviet factories, designed by American engineers in order to create the basis of Stalinism, which was collectivization, were copies of Ford, and they were licensed copies of Ford. Ford made money off of it. Stalinism would have been impossible without the cooperation of the Ford Motor Company. And Ford didn't do this because he was a communist sympathizer. Just look at his labor policies in the States. You won't find that. He was not a friend of labor in that regard, nor was he in any way in particular a Nazi. He was a businessman, and he invested in regimes and in situations that were going to make him a profit. And that, I think, is the fundamental answers to why these things are done. There can be other factors. It's not unusual to run across what could be called Marxist capitalists. People who, while very avid and acquisitive capitalists, nevertheless internally, like a kind of private religion, are sympathetic to the ideas of socialism or Marxism. But it's not necessary for them to be so. It's just necessary for them to see a economic advantage in investing in one thing or another.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this again in a bit because I want to ask you about Synarchy, but I was re-watching that episode this morning and last night, and you make a note in there about how the Synarchists, but I think this applies to other groups, sort of have, well, I think what you said was ideologically fluid or something to that effect. Like they're willing to partner with people who may have the polar opposite views, and I think what you're describing kind of emphasizes that these industrialists might be motivated by supporting a government that's going to have beneficial policies, or just getting their products out there, gaining more wealth, et cetera. And so that means they'll work with people who have polar opposite views, not necessarily always united by ideology. Because I think what will happen sometimes in like the conspiracy space, people hear the research about the funding of the Bolsheviks and the Nazi regimes by Western powers, and then assume that must mean that they shared the same ideology. So Ford and these Western powers were secret Nazis, and this is, something to that effect, when, as you just said, it's not necessarily always that they're going to be united by ideology. But it does seem like, at least from my perspective, they might lack a certain moral compass and be willing to work with, anybody as long as it furthers their ends.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Moral compasses are tricky things. And it's there are those I've had people argue to me that, morality is it gets in the way practically, that it's a collection of wives' tales largely meant to control human behavior, but which has no actual application in reality. I mean, that's a rather unpleasant way of looking at it. But there's something to, here's a way that it was once put to me, which has always stuck with me. This is one of these statements that kind of always sort of haunts me in a particular way. And it has to do with, remember, one of the things that we like to appeal to is reason. Okay, that reason. Yeah, and then remember, reason is supposedly the great historical antidote to superstition. So we talk about the 18th century as the age of reason. Reason is the basis of science. All of these things will solve our problems if we simply apply reason. And I think that often suggests to a lot of people that reason is its own kind of morality. Well, here's the statement that haunts me, and I can't even remember at this point who it was who told me this, is they go, the voice of reason, if you're listening, isn't the one that's telling you to show mercy. The voice of reason is the one that's telling you not to leave any witnesses. Because that would be what would, if you simply, reason is a kind of calculation. It's a kind of algebra that works out. You create a formula and it's going to give you an answer. And the answer may be, the safest thing to do is just to kill these people. Letting them go, or they might possibly turn you in, or you might get caught, that's not reasonable. I mean, it might be the moral thing to do, but it's not reasonable from your standpoint of survival. So I think this is one of the things that's often done. Never confuse reason or logic with morality. They are not the same thing.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate there's a tension there that, like you said, it might not make us feel so comfortable when putting in those terms, but it's probably a thought process that some of these folks that you've covered in your work have seen themselves in, because you end up covering a lot of different shady characters from different pieces of history. Before we dive further into that, something you said a moment ago actually brought up a question that I think maybe some in the audience would appreciate. You mentioned the digitization of archives and research. In fact, just this last night as I'm doing my research, I use resources like newspapers.com, and you can go and search and find all kinds of old papers. And I was looking for some old articles on the Bilderberg Group. I found one from 1963. I think it might be the first U.S. Mention of them. And there's different resources like that. But do you have any particular things you would offer to researchers out there? I mean, there are going to be folks in the audience who maybe also kind of see themselves as taking a forensic approach to this type of research. And of course, in the age of the internet, many people don't know what microfilm is or microfiche, or they just use Google. That's just what they're used to. I have the benefit, which I do appreciate, kind of nerding out on, having gone to certain universities and dig through boxes and find box number 30 with this old archive and this and that. But as you said, it can be very time consuming, and even some of those things are starting to be digitized at certain universities, a lot of collections of old research papers. But is there anything you would offer, whether a specific tool or even just a mindset that folks who are listening could take with them as they approach their own research of these topics?
Well, there are lots of digital resources available. So if you're going to do something if you're going to look up information on people, not just genealogical research, Ancestry.com, there are others like it, but Ancestry is probably the one that I use most commonly. And that's just where you can find public records. You can you can find out whether or not a person exists. All right, you can, because people leave some degree of paper trail. Usually there are birth and death records, social security records, military records. It's pretty difficult to go through life, from the late 19th century and not leave some kind of record behind you. So those are the things that you can look for. And there's also a very interesting resource called Fold3, which is closely, I think, is owned by the same people that own Ancestry. That has a lot of military records, enlistment records, even medical records in some cases. It's got a huge one of the things I found very useful is that it's got the old Bureau of Investigation file. So before there was the FBI, there was just the BI, and the early files up until the early 1920s, sort of spanning the First World War period, which is an interesting period, are all digitized and available there, and that's where you can find things just by putting in a search term and finding what sort of files come up. A tremendous number of those files, by the way, are simply headlined miscellaneous, which means that it gives you no actual description of what's in them. But so that's very useful. Newspapers.com, newspaper archive. It can get a little pricey. Individually, these things, the subscriptions aren't much. But it's, I use both newspapers.com and newspaper archives, and I've used others because while they have different selection, you'll find some newspapers that are in one that are not in another. So you can sometimes turn up different articles depending upon which databases that you're looking at. So those are all kinds of, newspaper records, all kinds of things find their way into the newspapers. And doesn't necessarily mean, here's the thing I would argue, these are all what we would tend to call primary sources, particularly the public records. Never assume automatically that everything that appears in a public record is true or is accurate, because there are inaccuracies. People get things wrong when they write them down. People lie about things. People give different names. There can be different spellings of names. Certainly you never want to automatically assume that because something's printed in a newspaper, it's true. I guarantee you that is not necessarily the case. There are all kinds of mistakes in there. But what it does show is what was said at that place at that time. It's an actual artifact, it's a thing that you've got. So you've got a newspaper article which describes an event. This is someone's description, and there probably are different you might find another description which is different, but you've got an actual description to work from, and that's when you begin to compare different points of information. So in terms of doing research, here's one of the things to always keep an eye out for. Generally, one of the things you want to look for, because there is a lot of inaccuracy. So these things you have to keep in mind. Mistakes happen. Reporters get creative with how they report things. And most simply, people lie. Now, that's, again, one of those things that we know we don't generally talk about. But yes, that people lie about everything all the time, often for no particular reason. Those, by the way, are the most baffling and troubling of lies, because in some cases you can figure out people would have a motivation to lie, to cover their ass, for instance. But in other cases, people just seem to lie just to do it, just to tell a yarn. So there's always there's what actually happened, and then there are the embellishments of it as things go along. And that becomes part of history. That becomes part of newspaper reporting. It even finds its way into public records. So it's very difficult not impossible, but it's difficult, and it requires a lot of work and attention to try to create as accurate a picture of a person or an event as you can. Because this is one of the things you're going to find. When you begin to study an event or a person, you're going to get different views. People will have different opinions. You know, it's the same case. You can have two people in the same place at the same time, ostensibly witnessing the same thing, but I guarantee you that their recollections will not be identical. There will be little differences between them. And that doesn't even mean that they're lying. It just means that's what their sort of impressions were at the time. Two people in the same place at the same time, facing in different directions, will have different experiences. They will be describing different things, even though they might have been standing within a few feet of each other. So never assume that there's just some trove of, you know, you're eventually going to come to the file that has the absolute unvarnished truth, because that doesn't exist. From the moment an observation is made, from the moment something happens, there begins a whole kind of process of storytelling and mythology about it, and that will change over time. So what you want to look for to get as close to the truth as you can, you want to find where you have different data points, where you find the same thing being said from different sources. And you have to be careful about that, because what you'll often see, let's say you find the same sort of story repeated in 6 different books. Okay. They're all books about World War II, let's say, or whatever it is, and they all basically have the same story in them. Well, you could go, well, there's 6 different sources. There are 6 different authors who repeat this. Well, what you have to do is figure out what the chronology is here. And this is where you look at footnotes and you look at sources. This is why those things are included. This is why it's assumed that if you're going to come up with some particular fact or piece of information, that you say where you got that from so it can be traced back. Well, here's what you might find. If you look carefully, if you perform due diligence, you're going to figure out that this statement or this story, which is repeated in 6 different books, all appears it begins in a book published, let's say, in 1920. All of the other 5 sources follow after it, and they're essentially all quoting each other. So the 1920 story is then repeated in a 1930 book, which is then repeated in 2 books in the 1940s, which is then picked up and repeated again. So what you have here are not 6 different data points. You have one data point, which is just repeated, repeated, repeated. And of course, as a story is repeated over and over again, where people read it in more than one source, that then becomes generally accepted as truth. Whereas the reality is, it's just an unattributed story that appeared in the original book. So what you would want, true different data points, are people talking or referencing or describing the same thing, but they're not just copying each other. These are independent statements that come from different people at different times about a particular event.
I feel like that's only gotten worse in the age of the internet because now stories get put on memes, and then those memes get shared all over the place, and they can get 1 million, views or clicks or whatever. And there's rarely often with the meme a link to an article with the source or, something you can follow. But I've found myself often in this kind of conspiracy research space, even becoming a fact checker for other researchers or things that get kind of shared out there. I'll just mention one briefly, that the topic of water fluoridation has been something I've been researching for over a decade. And as a journalist, I was the only journalist in the federal courtroom in San Francisco last year when there was a federal lawsuit against the EPA about water fluoridation. Something I've paid a lot of attention to. And when you go down that rabbit hole, you see things like the Nazis used fluoride in the concentration camps, or the communists used fluoride in the concentration camps. It's a meme that gets repeated around. And so one day, years ago, I decided to try to track this down, and pretty much what you were just describing there is it's in this book, it's in this book, it's, gets repeated. And eventually I was able to find like what the original claim came from. And the source that I found listed was a reference to a newspaper around World War II that made this claim, but I couldn't find in newspapers or other newspapers.com or other archives any archive or copy or link to this alleged newspaper article. And it may have existed, it may not have ever existed. It could be true and it's just lost to the page, lost to history. But I always tell folks when it comes to that there's much better research points instead of trying to reference something that is based on this story and this story and this story, and we have no conclusive original source for it. But that's the kind of thing that I see happening often. Yeah, so with AI, more and more people are relying on AI to give them answers. And I've seen more than a few times where if you prompt it for a certain question, even in my research, I don't really use AI that much. I'm not, against it or anything, but it's just not I'm okay with doing my own digging. But just as an example, as I was doing some research for the Pyramid of Power, I asked it about a particular topic. It gave me some information that I thought was useful. And then as I tried to go dig down and find the source for this information, because I'm not just going to trust what the AI tells me, I could not find any source for this. And after about a half an hour to an hour of digging and digging and digging, I went back to this AI bot and said, you previously said XYZ. Can you provide me the source that you have on this? And then the bot admitted that it had made a mistake and that it had confused some things and that the information it gave me was not accurate. It confused different meetings at different years that had the same people, this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I think it's just, I share that to say it's always important for us to do our due diligence, and especially anybody out there hearing this who in the broader research community, the search for truth and the search for, understanding history, if you want to really get as close to that truth or as close as we can possibly get, then we need to do this due diligence that you're describing here. And that's why I wanted to interview you first off, because I do appreciate that approach. Like I was saying earlier, you're not just dismissive of things, but you're also, like in the course, I'll hear you kind of add caveats about, well, we have this piece of information, or even in your example, like you said, it might go back to one book. One book doesn't necessarily mean that it was true just because it's written in a book from 100 years ago or 150 years ago. You have to consider that person's biases and the relationships, et cetera, and look for further confirmation. So I do appreciate your kind of steadfast on that aspect of this. Well,
thanks. Of course, that's also one of the things that other people and I personally get criticism for, is of being, I've been called wishy-washy because I won't come to I won't definitely say that this is right and this is wrong. This is the true story. And, in my own defense, I'll say I'm not being wishy-washy. The point is I just haven't seen anything that would, I don't know. I have information, but it's inconsistent. And I'm not just going to, there's a big tendency, and this is one of the things that happens when you're going into something, this is I'm talking to anybody who's researching out of here, you always got to kind of check yourself. So why are you researching this question? Is it because this is something you really want to know more about, or have you already basically decided what your point of view is and you're just looking for information to prove that? Because if you're just looking for information to essentially confirm your prejudices, which is what that would be, then that's what you can find plenty of that. But you're not looking at the whole picture. You've just kind of found a story that you like, and you're going to stick with that story and run with it, and you're going to, cherry pick the information that tends to support it. There's a great tendency to do that, and it's one of those things you have to be conscious of in yourself all the time. And it gets into what I call the whole sort of good story factor. So let's say you've got different versions of an event for the story which isn't too difficult to do. Well, the good story is the one that has, dragons in it. The good story is the one that has more drama and tension in it. And that's naturally going to draw more attention. And what happens over time is that not necessarily the most accurate story, but the good story is going to attract more attention. And like, I'll give you an example of this. I'd like to give you an example, and it's one of those things. So take as an example the Roswell so-called UFO incident. 1947, New Mexico. The general story is that in Roswell, New Mexico, a flying saucer crashed, and the Air Force recovered it, and claimed it was a balloon. Whole story. Well, that was one of those things. That's something I just sort of started looking into a few years ago. That for years I had ignored. So, I'm not a UFO guy really. But I think it's interesting to actually apply what could be called historical methodology to a lot of these things, which doesn't seem to be a lot of it. And what you've got in the case of Roswell is that from the beginning, you've got two different stories. So on the one hand, you've got statements. You've got this guy, Mac Brazel, who's a rancher, who, in June of 1947, he and his kids are out. He's in the middle of, first of all, it's not in Roswell. That town is almost 80 miles away. So it's out in the middle of nowhere on this ranch. And they come across this scattered debris, which they find. So, and his daughter, who saw this, gave almost the same statement that her father did, more than, he was talking, he had an interview in 1947 where he describes what they found. She in the 1990s remembers what they found, and they don't describe any kind of saucer space. What they describe is a bunch of stuff scattered across the field, which consists of a kind of tin foil with a rubberized backing, paper tape, and sticks. Right? It's like a kite that's come apart. There's no metal. There's no engine. There's no propellers. Nobody ever mentions this stuff. There's not anything that they describe that would make any kind of coherent spacecraft, because you're not going to build an airplane of any kind out of the stuff that they describe finding. So I was thinking, this is what they just, you got two data points here. You've got one witness who's describing it decades later, and another describing it right after it happened, and they're basically describing the same. They talk about paper tape that has flowers imprinted on them. They talk about Scotch tape. Apparently there was something that was recognizable as Scotch tape. Now, Brazel eventually goes to town, talks to the sheriff. Sheriff goes to the local Air Force base. It's kind of unusual for what appears to be debris that must have blown in from somewhere to be out in the middle. So the Air Force go out and collect all of this stuff, which I think one person describes that when you put all of this light material together, it probably all weighed 5 pounds. And then the next day, the local Air Force base issues a press release which finds its way into the paper, where they proclaim that they have captured a flying saucer. They don't give any description of it. They don't say we found little pieces of stuff. They give no description over what's actually described as found. Instead, for some reason, they say they found a flying saucer, which then later is analyzed and they decide it's a weather balloon. So now then you got three different stories. So you get the stories from eyewitnesses who don't describe a saucer, certainly no bodies. They just describe a bunch of scattered light debris, tape and sticks, and tinfoil. Excuse me. And then you got the Air Force, who for some reason issues this press release that we found a flying saucer. Then the Air Force later, elsewhere analyzes it and go, no, it's just a wrecked weather balloon. So within a space of days, there are three different versions, and they're not compatible with each other. Now, the debate continues to this day as to which of those versions is true. So people, now here's the question. Which of those is the better story? Which of those is a meteor story? The one where you find a bunch of tape and sticks and tinfoil out in the middle of a field? Now, there's no there, is there? The one where it's just a kind of wrecked weather balloon? That's not very interesting. But a flying saucer? Okay, and better yet, a flying saucer with tiny alien bodies scattered around. They then get added into the story. See, it's like a fish story. The fish never gets smaller. It always tends to expand. So I'm not even going to sit here and go into the whole thing as to which of those stories are true. I mean, I could give you the idea of which one seems to be more likely based in reality, but I can also tell you which one is the best story, and that's the one that has a flying saucer and alien bodies. And notice that's the one which has gotten all of the coverage. That's what people want to talk about. And they don't want to talk about it because they have any real evidence for it. There isn't any. No one has ever presented any. There are no pictures. You know, there's no credible evidence of that at all. I'm not insisting it didn't happen, but it gets the attention because it's a good story.
Absolutely. And again, in the age of the internet, the best story will go viral, whether it's true or not. It's a whole other thread that I'm not going to pull on now, but that's interesting that you say, you know, it's the Air Force that first puts out the press release with the kind of more flashy story, which makes me wonder why. But let's bring it back to a little bit of history now and some of the work you've done. I'm curious, we've already went into briefly the Russian Revolution, and you alluded to secret societies involved in, you know, France and of course America, elsewhere in different revolutions. What war, revolution, or world event would you say, based on your research, was most influenced by secret societies? And I know, again, that you add the caveat that, like, the presence of the secret societies doesn't necessarily inherently mean they were controlling every step of, you know, said event. But generally speaking, what would you say of the last, you know, just throughout history of the last 100 years or so, was a major event that had the fingerprints of secret societies all over it?
Well, that's actually relative. There are other ones, but the ones that can come to mind is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914, which sets off the First World War for reasons that aren't entirely clear. And that's the watershed of all modern history. The First World War is, you know, there's no World War II without World War I. There's arguably no Bolshevik revolution, no Nazi regime without that. That's formed our entire modern history. Virtually everything that goes on into the 20th and into the 21st century is a continuation of things that were set off in what was then called the Great War. And for whatever reason, the assassination of this one man is what lit the fuse that led to that war and the watershed of modern history. So, and there you've got, you know, secret societies are all over the place, and they're highly visible, and their role is not really debatable. They're not imaginary. So first of all, Franz Ferdinand was killed as the result of a fairly elaborate conspiracy. There's no question about that either. So you want an example of actual conspiracies affecting historical events? Well, that's exhibit number one. So what have you got working here? You know, he's shot by one man, Gavrilo Princip, but Princip was only part of a whole team of assassins. So on that particular day in Sarajevo, the plan was to kill Franz Ferdinand while he was in a motorcade. Guess what? Traveling from one point to another. And you had a whole group of half dozen or more young assassins armed with pistols and bombs, basically hand grenades, waiting along the route to strike. And this had all been planned ahead of time, and there were people supervising them. They were members. You have this whole kind of Russian nesting doll group of secret society. So these assassins were members of a thing called Mlada Bosna, Young Bosnia, which was a kind of Serbian nationalist society. Politically, most of them would describe themselves as anarchists, which was kind of interesting. They don't even necessarily see themselves entirely as Serb nationalists. They see themselves as kind of anarchist revolutionaries, serving some sort of greater cause beyond that. Their own motivations are somewhat obscure. But they've been recruited to be part of this assassination team. But the ultimate secret society behind this is a thing called Ujedinjeni Smrt, Union or Death. I love saying that, okay. Is unity or death. Now that was a nationalist secret society based in the Serbian military. So what you had, Serbia, Bosnia was part of Austria-Hungary. Franz Ferdinand was, sort of destined to become the heir of this empire. And there was a great deal of rivalry in neighboring Serbia, which wanted to control that territory. And so it fostered these nationalist and terrorist groups to carry out these actions. So you have one secret society infiltrating and using another secret society in order to carry out a political murder. And in fact, Union or Death. But Union or Death also has another name. It's known as the Black Hand, Crna Ruka. The Black Hand's emblem has a crossbones and skull, a bottle of poisons, a dagger, and a pistol. They're completely. This is a group mostly based in the Serbian army, which had murdered the king of Serbia back in 1903. Because they didn't think he was nationalist enough for their tastes. And then which now was going to murder another monarch to further their goals. Their ultimate goal was the creation of a greater Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. So this is why they wanted to kill Franz Ferdinand and destroy the empire that he was part of. But the actual assassins that they've gotten, they've recruited through another group, and those assassins seem to be more kind of, see themselves as anarchist revolutionaries than they do nationalists. And we know about this because Princip, the actual killer, and other members of this conspiracy are arrested. They're all caught and they're put on trial in Austro-Hungarian courtroom, and they confess. They talk quite openly about their interests and their background. Most of them aren't sentenced to death because you had to be 21 to be hanged in Austria-Hungary, and Princip and others are younger than that, so they get prison terms. Most of them end up dead anyway. He dies of tuberculosis in prison, but nevertheless, it's interesting what they say. And then in their trial, they're asked about their connections to Freemasonry, and many of them commit, they're going, this person or that person there's this whole kind of Masonic aspect to it. Somebody makes this kind of weird statement that, Franz Ferdinand had been sentenced to death by a Masonic Congress some years earlier, and we were just kind of carrying out that death sentence. So, they don't even attribute this. They suggest that somehow behind the Black Hand, behind Union or Death, there's some sort of strange Masonic conspiracy at work. You have other strange details that the whole critical plan to plot the assassination isn't carried out in Serbia or in Bosnia. It's carried out in Toulouse, France. For some reason, that the conspirators from the Balkans go to France in order to carry this out. There are suggestions in that, by the way. I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but that French intelligence, that French political interests may have encouraged this. And that was, that's partly because France is an ally of Russia. Russia's backing Serbia. That there was actually some kind of intelligence operation working here. There's a calculated effort here to kill a man, and beyond that, perhaps a calculated effort to ignite a war. And then you've got these different sort of conspiratorial things. That a lot of Bosnia, young Bosnia is real. It's a real society. The Black Hand is a real, murderous, conspiratorial, secret society. And then you have these intimations of some kind of Masonic death sentence that's been placed on Franz Ferdinand. Maybe these guys were just confused. Maybe they had been fed some sort of story to confuse them. But it's much more complicated than one might have assumed. So what you know is that there was a conspiracy to carry out an assassination, and that assassination led to a world war. What you don't know is exactly where it goes and where it begins. It's still frustratingly but tantalizingly unclear who are all the parties involved and what their actual agenda is, with the possibility that you have different groups with different agendas.
Yeah, and I think that that is sometimes unsatisfying for people to not have like one finger to point, one group they can point the finger at or tie everything up in a nice bow and say it was the Masons or it was this. And yeah, definitely, like you said, the World War I has an abundance of secret societies in there in different ways, and the assassination is one big aspect of that. I want to ask you a couple more questions about the course and some of the work you cover there. This is not intended to be just an advertisement for the course, but if anybody is interested, I will link that below in the show notes because I think it's a great bit of research for those who are new to these topics and even those like myself who feel like I've gone down these rabbit holes and been studying them for 15 years, but there's still so much more that I think you bring to the table. And one of those is Synarchy. I'd like to talk about that for a moment, and obviously it's a big topic. You cover it somewhat in depth in the course, but for those who are not really familiar, even with just the term itself and the meaning, I think you describe it as joint rule in the course. Could you tell us just briefly? I know it's a tale that you weave in the course, but just about the history of this, and because what intrigued me, I'll say, is that this discussion of, I have it pulled up right here, of in the final report, the 18-page report by one of the French chief, Chauvin, I think is his name, that he points to Chauvin from everybody from technocrats to people in high finance, and what you said here was that he warned that Synarchy was ultimately an international movement run by a so-called high bank. So I'd be curious if you have any more details on who or what that high bank was, but just start, maybe we could just learn more about what Synarchy is or was.
Well, let's go back to what Synarchy was. The term, again, means joint rule or to rule together, which, that doesn't sound too sinister, and which sounds oddly sort of like anarchy. But one way to think of it is that Synarchy poses as a kind of opposite of anarchy. So anarchy is opposition to the state. So anarchists aren't opposed to rule. I'm not trying to defend anarchy or attack it, but let's say anarchists, generally speaking, isn't that they don't have any rules and they just run amok all the time. It's that they're fundamentally opposed to a state and to a hierarchy. They believe that a state, a government hierarchy, a thing with, kings, ministers, bishops, and all the rest of it, is an artificial invention meant to oppress people. And that left to their own devices, people through spontaneous order can govern themselves without a state apparatus. So that's why anarchists tend to go around blowing up, assassinating government figures. But that's only a part of it. But so Synarchy is not opposed to the state, although it's opposed to the kind of political order that existed in the modern era. It has no particular interest in things like elections or there's nothing democratic about it. So what does it mean? Well, to kind of understand that, you got to go back to the origin. So the term Synarchy comes from one guy, as far as I can tell. The first one to ever use it was a French occultist. You can call him an esotericist, but he was very much interested in the occult, in mysticism, in arcane wisdom, and the secrets of the universe, that whole ball of wax. In the late 19th century, in the 1880s, Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedra, Frenchman from noble background, again, very interested in the esoteric, and what he claimed is that he was approached by a representative of the wise men of the East. He's sort of, if anybody's familiar with Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and the whole idea of the Mahatmas and the ascended masters, it's this idea that crops up again and again, is that, I don't know, somewhere levitating on a mountain in Tibet are a group of ascended beings who are guiding the spiritual destiny of mankind. And every now and then they sort of deign to go out and select someone as their representative and give them some sort of vague advice as to what to do. It's a strange way to operate, but that's the story that comes up. So Sandeev argues that he was approached by an emissary of the Ascended Masters, and they had picked him as what else? Their representative, and it's also connected to a kind of mystical hidden city of Agartha, which is governed by this kind of religious ruled by the king of the world, and is assisted by his spiritual advisors. That's a term which crops up again. Agartha is kind of the same thing as Shambhala or Shambhala. It's always this Shangri-La, that's another name for it, which is always off somewhere in the snow-capped mountains of Tibet, some inaccessible place where the secret masters that rule the world hang out. And they gave him advice they thought the world was going, the world's always going in the wrong direction from their standpoint. And so here's an idea that you should propagate to get things going. And so the basis of Synarchy was a reorganization of society into what could basically be called kind of estates. You go back into the idea, the old estates where you had the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. Okay, that was the simplest form of the estates. This is a little more complicated. And the idea was that you'd have different interest groups within society. So artisans would be one interest group, let's say. Industrialists would be another. The capitalists and the industrialists and the bankers, I guess, would all be one part of it. Technicians, inventors, hands-on, nuts and bolts people would yet be another group. So you would have these various constituent sort of guilds within society. Each would have a role in governing society, but over this would be the occultists, in a sense. It would be a new class of shamans. It would be the kind of occult illuminated elite, which would form a spiritual group that would kind of manage all of the others. So in a sense, Synarchy would subordinate all of the other interest groups in society, give them particular roles, but place them under the overall control, effectively, of a kind of politicized secret society, which would then guide that society by enlightened spiritual concepts. Sounds pretty simple. Again, it's kind of oddly suggestive of fascism that will come in later. Now, when I'm talking about fascism here, I'm not talking about fascism as the insult that people use it as. I'm talking about fascism as it actually was invented and practiced by Benito Mussolini in Italy. Okay, so this is the whole thing. I have to, as a small aside, it just irritates me to no end. I'm not defending I'm just saying that people use that term basically to describe some sort of what they think are right-wing politics that they don't like, maybe for good reason, maybe not. But they generally have no actual idea of what they're talking about when they're using the term, because fascism is a political movement invented in Italy in 1919 by one man, Benito Mussolini. He coined the term. He later wrote the Doctrine of Fascism. So fascism is only what he said it was. So that's what you need to look at. And he says lots of, and it's kind of difficult to figure that out. But I mean, his description isn't entirely clear. But fascism, Italian fascism, also kind of divided society into different groups. So the idea was that above everything you had the fascist party, and the fascist party was the only thing that looked out for the whole nation. And then the industrialists, labor, that's another constituent group. If you've got the industrialist, labor, the workers would be another portion of this. So labor, factory owners, artisans, farmers, all of these groups would again be organized into different guilds or interest groups, but it's the party which would keep everybody operating for the national interest. And this would override, it would reconcile all the conflicts between them. Similar in a way in which the enlightened, the kind of mystical adepts in Synarchy would reconcile all the differences between labor and management and artisans and farmers in Synarchy. Not exactly the same thing, but it's a kind of interesting, similar idea that shows up. So that's why sometimes Synarchy has been called government by secret society. That's oversimplifying it, but it is interesting that it actually enshrines what would otherwise be called occult orders into a position of almost leadership within these, because they would be considered to be the only ones who were enlightened to the true spiritual ideas. Everybody else are just workers of some form. So Santiago Dalvedra wrote this idea up, and then he got cold feet. Apparently, the masters came back to him and said, "Hey, you don't want to spread this idea around. You don't want people knowing about it." So his whole work that he wrote on Synarchy wasn't published until after his death in 1909. But then it was popularized.
Is that the Kingdom of Agartha? This is one of the books I have here on that topic. Was this the one that he originally wrote, or is this related to it? Are you familiar with this?
I think that's journey. Well, his original work was never published by him. It was published by one of his followers, a fellow by the name of Gerard Encausse.
Gotcha.
Gerard Encausse he had a mystical name, Papus. He became for a time a spiritual advisor to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Okay. So he's a French occultist. He's Rasputin before there was Rasputin. But he's also a French political operative. He's also operating as a kind of French political agent in Russia. So here again, you get this crossover between someone who's a kind of magician, an occultist who holds seances in which he conjures up the Tsar's dead father. He's also working as a political agent for the French government to expend French interest into the Russian court. And then he also views himself as a promoter of different ideas such as synarchism. And the idea gets out there, and it's then adopted by a variety of different esoteric groups in France. And this is where things get really complicated, and I'm going to have to, because it's France and there are a lot of these different groups. But by the time you get to the 1920s, there are several different groups that are somehow incorporating the term synarchy within it. And so and they have a lot of overlapping membership. You find out that the same person is the member of several different groups. So one of these groups, just to give an example, is a thing called Les Polaires, or the Polar Brotherhood. And this is because they somehow, well, as far as we can tell, they're kind of the French version of the Thule Society in Germany. In fact, I think they are. They think that at some point in the remote past, there was a advanced super civilization. There's always one of those, right? That was in the Arctic, the Hyperborean idea. And that's where they take the term polaires from, Polar Brotherhood. But they were also, they kind of took their orders from some other mystical entity that they communicated with through a kind of elaborate Ouija board. And they called it, they called this the Oracle of Astral Force. It's an interesting name. So the Oracle of Astral Force, which they operated, and it's like their version of AI. They went to it and they asked it questions and it gave them answers. That somehow was apparently communicating with, it's not clear whether it was communicating with the Mahatmas levitating inside, over Mount Everest, or whether it was extraterrestrials, because you get this weird sort of woo-woo UFO type of stuff that's connected with it. I mean, it's impossible without being a member to tell you exactly what they're doing. But they're using this fancy Ouija board to communicate, this Oracle of Astral Force, And these people are not just a bunch of kooks, or at least they're not just a bunch of kooks. No, one of them is the secretary to the French Chamber of Deputies. Is a very important, responsible position in the French government. A lot of others are engineers, technocrats, graduates of universities, educated, influential people, which are usually the type of people you find in esoteric secret societies to begin with. Remember, these groups don't tend to attract illiterate peasants. They don't attract factory workers. They attract people who generally view themselves, they're often university graduates. They often have some kind of technical or training. They view themselves as being erudite and cultured to one degree or another. They tend to think they're the smart people, and so they're sitting in a room using a fancy Ouija board to ask questions to some sort of interstellar AI. That's the best you can come up with. But that's all in, and then this is all connected with this thing called the Synarchist movement of empire. And the Synarchist movement of empire was a group incorporating other groups whose goal was to basically bring down the existing French Third Republic. That is, they wanted to destroy the existing government and to replace it with what they saw as a more practical and spiritually guided Synarchist government. Now, a lot of these people then find their way. So what eventually happens, to sort of go through, is that in 1940, the French Third Republic does collapse with the German invasion. So the Germans invade, France collapses very quickly, the Third Republic falls, and it's replaced with something we call the Vichy regime. So again, the general argument is that the Vichy regime was simply a bunch of French fascists and Nazi sympathizers who governed the country under German occupation. More complicated than that. There are lots of different groups, but Synarchists, people who earlier had been connected to the Synarchist movement, have a number of influential positions within the Vichy regime. And to some degree, there may be groups of Synarchists who are competing with other ones, as I would suspect. Because one of the things you find in these kind of groups is that no matter what they say about group loyalty and solidarity, personal differences arise. You get people who compete for leadership. So you could have a thing called the Synarchist movement of empire. But within that, probably, you had different individuals that were vying for dominance or power, which means that they're often competing against each other. So a guy who was important in a lot of these groups, everything from the Polaires to the Synarchist movement of empire, was a French engineer by the name of Jean Coutreau. He is found dead in 1941. At first, it looks like a suicide. The police officer who begins to investigate it, Henri Chauvin, decides that no, that Coutreau was murdered, probably by his Synarchist compatriots. And Chauvin finds this thing called the Synarchist Manifesto among Coutreau's. And this has the whole sort of Synarchist plan, over 500 different sort of points of the changes that we're going to make. And Chauvin begins to investigate. His investigation is hampered and largely ignored because he finds out that some of the people he's investigating are, this is like an X-Files thing where you start to investigate it and then you find out that the clues are leading more and more to your bosses. So his report never goes far, but he does, and so he sums this whole thing up as that somehow Synarchy in France was that it actually had brought about circumstances that had helped the French government collapse in 1940. That somehow it had kind of engineered France's defeat to destroy the Third Republic, to place Synarchists in positions of power. But it was also linked to a broader international movement, something that was much bigger over which there was this kind of high bank. And there are bankers who are involved in this, but he seems to be talking about something. He's using it as a kind of euphemism for something else. But the money, moving money around internationally, was an important part of this. Now, one of the things to look for in investigating things like this is one of the things you can find is that the same thing can arguably appear under different names, in the same way that the same person can appear under different names. That is, one man can use different names in different people. People may know them as a different, just from a conspiratorial standpoint. But what you'll find out is that different groups of people may be dealing with this person under different names, but it would only be through careful investigation that you would figure out that it's the same person using a different name in dealing with different groups of people. So you can look for this thing. So in the same period, 1920s, 30s, in fact, all the way up until the 1950s, there was a French, in the U.S. we'd call him a muckraker. He was a kind of, what now they call an investigative journalist. Someone who roots around looking for things that probably they shouldn't be doing. They're trying to dig up dirt. And this was a guy by the name of Roger Menevet. And he actually published a journal in which he tried to expose this. And Menevet is constantly talking about what he thinks is at the root of a lot of things in France as elsewhere, is what he calls the international oligarchy. And he names certain people that he thinks are part of this. So, for instance, there is a very prominent and sinister arms merchant in the early 20th century by the name of Basil Zaharoff. You ever heard of him? Okay. Well, Basil Zaharoff is kind of the original model for Bond villains. But he's a real guy. Nobody quite knows exactly where he came from. His ethnicity is debatable. But he starts out as a salesman for the Vickers Armaments Company. He sells things like machine guns, and then he sells things like cannons, and then he sells submarines. And he becomes very, very successful as an arms merchant, but then he branches out into other things. He branches out into oil and into radio and into media. He buys the casino in Monte Carlo. What he effectively does in the 1920s is he buys Monaco. He runs the little Principality of Monaco as his little private country, and he's one of the 20th century's first billionaires. But he's very, very secretive. There are very few photographs of him. He doesn't like having his picture taken. You don't find a lot written about him, but Zaharoff is the kind of 20th century's original man of mystery, and he is alleged to be all kinds of things. He's alleged to be a Satanist. He's alleged to be the ruler of some sort of high-ranking, esoteric Freemason, Rosicrucian, you name it. His name gets attached to everything because no one knows that much about him. So Menevet is convinced, I guess because this guy is, internationally important and a billionaire, that Zaharoff is part of this international oligarchy. But he's only a part of it. But Menevet thinks that there is this group of men, there are probably some women involved in it, but there's this group, a secretive elite that control vast amounts of wealth and much of the world economy, and that they cooperate with each other across any kind of, they have no particular loyalty to any country. They simply use countries as a means to an end. And that their basic goal is to amass power without responsibility, which means their goal is to rule behind the scenes. You know, they never want to become presidents. They don't want to become kings. They own presidents and kings. They buy them and trade them like cards in one form or another, in the same way that Zaharoff would just essentially buy the principality. You know, it's got a prince, but the prince just then becomes his kind of figurehead. So Meneve, as far as I know, Meneve doesn't mention Synarchy. He's not interested in it. I mean, he must mention it at some point. But what he looks at, he sees this thing, and he gives it the name International Oligarchy. And there's another guy who's connected to Zaharoff and the rest of it, a kind of spy businessman that I've written about by the name of Sidney Riley. And Riley describes this by another name. He calls it the occult octopus. Because you want to know how the world works? There's the occult octopus. And it's got its tentacles that go into all of these different. And I think by occult, he's mostly referring to it being hidden and unseen. So here's the question. You've got Synarchy that Chauvin is talking about, his Synarchist conspiracy and his high bank. You've got Meneve's international oligarchy, and you've got Riley's occult octopus. And when you set the names aside, they're essentially describing the same thing, which my operative theory, remember this isn't a fact, if I put it together, that's exactly what I think they're doing. That there's something that they're describing. They look at it and they give it a name, but what it actually is, you don't know.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for that. I think what's intriguing to me, and I think what the audience will find intriguing, especially those who've never heard the term Synarchy, that as you describe it in the course, besides the idea of replacing governments, but like you said, there would be global authoritarianism. You got financiers at the top, industrialists below, and then the technocrats, engineers. And then, of course, like you said, with the Synarchy specifically, they bring in the sort of spiritual, as you put it, spiritual snake oil salesmen to keep the masses in line. And whether we call it an international oligarchy or, cult octopus, that's an interesting term. I'm going to have to look more into that. I've been describing it just as the pyramid of power for my series I'm working on. I think it's clear to most people that there is some level of control structure that exists out there that does involve pieces of everything from finance to, there's some research going into looking at the organized crime and the role that organized crime played post-World War II, of course, the beginning of the OSS and into the CIA and intelligence agencies, that whatever pieces of the puzzle people want to point at, there, and whatever name we want to give it, it does appear that there is some kind of extra governmental infrastructure out there that is clearly impacting the world around us. And that is, I think that's what many of us out here are trying to understand better and trying to see how we can get closer to it. I wanted to ask you one last question as we start to wrap up here. I noticed in the course that the Jesuits were only mentioned a few times, and there's many people out there who would, in their view, put the Jesuits as the ultimate person at the top or the ultimate group. What are your thoughts on that? Is the Royal Society of Jesus, and if you've come across any research that they've played a similar role, like the way you can point to Freemasons and other secret societies impacting world events, do you think they're also an important player?
Well, some people do. Some people argue that the Jesuits are behind, the Jesuits are behind the Illuminati, and the Illuminati is behind everything else. And the reason they would make that is that, the actual Illuminati that you can see, so I'm not talking about the Illuminati meme, which, the Illuminati is the other term which is given to this group, this supposedly control faction. So in the 18th century, one of the things that we know is that in Bavaria, in the city of Ingolstadt, at the Jesuit university there, a professor of canon law, Adam Weishaupt, in 1776, formed a secret society that he at one point called the Order of Perfectibilists, and which were then generally known as the Illuminati, which is a term that doesn't tell you very much because all that the Illuminati are simply those who are enlightened. Okay? That's it. We are the enlightened. Enlightened to what exactly? Well, I'm not going to tell you that. You have to be enlightened to figure it out. And so Weishaupt had this grand plan, and his grand plan was to use this group to infiltrate other societies like Freemasonry and to recruit not peasants and workers, but educated men from even members of the nobility, the clergy, people of influence, and to use that as a movement which would do what? Which would overturn all existing governments and religions and replace it with a society governed by this enlightened elite. Sound vaguely familiar? I mean, is that kind of the synarchist idea in an earlier guise? I don't know. See, this is the question. Is this the case of people in different places in time just reinventing the wheel? Or is this the wheel that's running continuously under different names? Remember, both of those are possibilities. Don't force it. And you have to keep both those possibilities in mind if you're going to investigate this seriously. Because as soon as you begin to focus on one, you begin to ignore everything else. So Weishaupt's society, as far as we can tell, never seemed to accomplish very much visibly, although invisibly, it never really ends. It's not effectively destroyed. It's banned, but it continues to function. And so one idea is that the Bavarian Illuminati continued to grow and metastasize and spawn any number of other groups, of which Synarchy could conceivably be a version by the time we get 100 years down the road. That's maybe yet another name that had, because, Illuminati wasn't the real name of his group. Weishaupt at one point says, never let our society be known anywhere under its real name, which is never uttered. So it's not the Society of Perfectibilists. It's not even really the Illuminati, which is simply the enlightened ones. And maybe that's it. Maybe it doesn't have a name. Maybe it just whatever name is applicable. I mean, if you're part of a group and you have a common goal, you know who you are. What do you need a name for? You can operate as anything in that regard. So it's and that's one of the questions I have about these things. Whether you're looking at this process of continual reinvention, an idea comes up, it gets dropped, somebody else comes up with it, it gets dropped, it gets invented again. Every 100 years this idea comes along. Or is there this unseen continuity? Are we just getting these periodic glimpses of something that's always there, but usually operating invisibly? Not sure. Could be, I know that's an unsatisfying answer, but I'm not sure, and there's no other way to put it.
I think it's better to temper your answers and research in that way that you're doing there, because I do agree there are too many people who have perhaps too much confidence in their conclusions and, or as you stated earlier, kind of whatever reason they're pointing in one direction, which could ultimately be the right direction, but then they only search for the pieces that confirm that answer that they're looking for. And I've had these questions as well in my own research, even as I'm doing this series and just diving back to some of the things I may have previously believed and inspecting them a little bit deeper and realizing, okay, maybe this isn't exactly as I first learned, as accurate as I thought it was. Where people, for example, as I know you've come across, people claim some of the current secret societies or whoever the Illuminati is or whatever name you want to give to a hidden ruling class, that they can trace their lineage all the way back to ancient Egyptian secret societies or to the Pythagorean secret societies. And I think it's a bit murkier, like you're pointing out, that there may be some lineage being carried down, or is just other people trying to mimic things that they've learned about from the past. Of course, it's always the possibility that this is the same group continuously working generationally, passing down knowledge and staying hidden. And as you said, occasionally we get a glimpse of it from in the public view, but I don't think we can conclusively say for certain. So I do appreciate the nuance that you bring to this topic, even if some people might find it dissatisfactory for them because you're not pointing at whatever culprit they point to.
Let's go back for a minute. That thing about the Jesuits. So I mentioned that there were people who look at Weishaupt and the Illuminati and they go, all right, he's Jesuit trained. All right, the whole thing begins at a Jesuit university. Therefore, and this was in fact said about him at the time, that Weishaupt was in fact secretly a Jesuit, and that the Illuminati were in fact the Jesuits, or were a Jesuit-controlled society. Now, keep in mind that the time that this was going on, the Jesuit order was banned. So they fell afoul of the papacy in the late 18th century, and for some I think into the early 19th century, there were a whole fairly strong period of, I think, 30 years they were banned. They were never effectively destroyed, but they fell out of favor with the popes and were put on the shelf. It looked like they were going to go the Knights Templar route, but then eventually they come back. Now, the reason for that was that even within the Vatican, there were those people who had long argued that the Jesuits had gone rogue, that they had too much power, they were independent, that the leader of the order had become the so-called Black Pope in his own right, and that they were no longer in sync with the Church. In fact, they had become an order which had taken over the Church for their own insidious purposes, whatever those were. And those accusations were serious enough to get the Jesuits banned for a period of time. So that's why there are those who argue that this Illuminati stuff is taking place during when the Jesuits are out of favor, and therefore the Illuminati order was invented by them, by one of their trained academics, in order to carry on their insidious work. Well, that makes a good story. You could write a book about that, right? Dan Brown probably has put in something. Doesn't mean that it's true, just means that it's a good story. But that suspicion had been there, and the Jesuits were, they did have a lot of power, and that power did disturb people in the Church and elsewhere. And the other thing about the Jesuits is that one of the main accusations against them is that they were practitioners of what was, I think I'm pronouncing, casuistry, which was pretty simple. The Jesuit order was created as a weapon of counter-reformation. So they arise back in the late 16th century by Ignatius Loyola, who was a soldier in his background, and who wanted to organize a kind of militant order that would combat Protestantism, and would combat it by any means necessary. So the idea in casuistry was that, one, you could turn an argument, you could again sort of use reason, or what would appear to be logical argument, in order to justify any cause. But what it boiled down to is that whatever served the interests of the Holy Roman Catholic Church was good, or was at least permissible, and whatever opposed the interests of the Holy Roman Catholic Church was evil and to be destroyed. That was the only thing that similar to the idea that centuries later, the first head of the Soviet secret police, the Cheka, a fellow by the name of Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, who also had been schooled by Jesuits, interestingly enough, would argue that which serves the interest of the revolution is good. Anything which opposes the interest of the revolution is bad. That's the only morality that we as Chekists have. We serve the revolution, and if it furthers its interests, this is permissible. So the Jesuits, again, this is what made some people nervous. They were arguing that anything is permissible so long as it ultimately serves the interests of the Church. Anything. Murder, lying, crime, anything of this sort. And that's why people would then later argue that Weishaupt's immoral philosophy behind the Illuminati was in some way the working out of a Jesuit concept. And it's an intriguing possibility. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I think that all of that is BS, but at the same time, I'm not going to tell you that any of it is truth, because you can't prove it.
And that's what we need to focus on, what we can actually prove. I really appreciate your time today, Professor Spence, and just getting to know you and your research a little bit better. I will, again, link everybody who wants to perhaps pursue going deeper and checking out the course that he has online, and of course the links to your books that we've mentioned today. This for me is just been a really fun conversation, because as I said, I feel like I'm within somewhat the conspiracy research space, but often feel like I'm kind of a solo traveler because of how skeptical I tend to be about different topics, and not willing to just sort of follow the narrative of whatever people are putting out there, that it's the Jews, it's the Jesuits, it's this group that we want to point at to, and often with some historical backing to their claims, but not necessarily being willing to be honest and say, we can't for sure know. We can't 100% prove this. So I do appreciate that you bring that to the table, and your historian background, your academic background. I think that's really what is needed for people who look at conspiracies and just really its history, and I try to take it from a true crime perspective. But people are too dismissive of it. So I think we need more of this type of tact if there's ever going to be more of a public acknowledgement of the role of secret societies in history and of just different groups there. Any other closing thoughts you'd like to offer?
Well, is there one more thing I can plug? Okay. So
yeah, of course. Please plug anything you got.
The great courses. So if you go to the great courses are Real History, Secret Societies, Crimes of the Century, Secrets of the Occult. I'm working on a couple of other things. But the one thing I would like to plug in addition to that is that, for some reason, a friend and I have decided that we were going to do what? Start a podcast. So yeah, okay. I said I would never do it. Now I'm doing it. So it's available on YouTube. I think you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I don't know what the other ones are because I don't do the tech end of things. But it's called Strange as It Seems. So on YouTube, you can find it as Strange as It Seems podcast. It's just my friend and I talking, but among the episodes that we have up 8 so far. We have one on occult politics, which talks about Synarchy. We have one on James Shelby Downard, one on Jack Parsons. We're going to be coming out with one on occult technology, all kinds of weird stuff there, includes Tesla and others, and hopefully, we plan to have more. So if you're interested, go take a look there. A lot of things we've been talking about here are addressed in some of those episodes. Of course, like and subscribe. I swore I would never utter those words, but there they are. See, that's how it works. So anyway, that's the last of my shameless plugs.
I love it. Thank you. I didn't know that you had a podcast. I will definitely link that in the show notes for everybody who wants to go further. I highly encourage you to, because I think your work is very rewarding for those who decide to dive down there. Everybody, thanks for listening today. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast and that at least it's given you some references to dig into and go further down the rabbit hole. I will once again remind you to check out the show notes, check out all of Rick Spence's work, worth your time. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.